Mia's small body hit the ground alone. No mother's arms, no father's voice, just the autumn leaves of Portland and Marco's weathered hands lifting her toward salvation. Hours later, when CEO James Hunter finally arrived at the hospital, his world fractured at the sight of Eleanor's locket resting against his daughter's chest, the same locket his late wife wore the day she begged him to spend more time with their girl. Marco stood in the shadows, and James suddenly understood that some strangers carry our greatest debts. Subscribe to witness how one desperate hour rewrites everything a father thought he knew about love, loss, and the invisible people who save us. The park stretched empty under the grey October sky, its benches vacant and its pathways silent except for the whisper of wind through dying leaves. Mia Hunter sat alone on the swing, her small fingers wrapped around the rusted chains, her legs dangling without the energy to push herself forward. She had wandered here after school, seeking the solitude her 9-year-old heart craved when the house felt too large and too quiet, without her mother's laughter filling its rooms. The other children had long since gone home, called by parents who noticed the darkening clouds and the chill creeping into the air. But no one called for Mia. Her father was in another meeting, his phone silenced, his attention consumed by spreadsheets and conference calls that stretched into the evening. She swung gently, the motion almost unconscious, while nausea bloomed in her stomach and her vision began to blur at the edges. The sickness had started during math class, a dull ache that she dismissed as hunger or nervousness about the upcoming spelling test. By the time school ended, the ache had transformed into something sharper, something that made her breath come in shallow gasps and her skin feel clammy despite the cool autumn air. She thought of calling her father, but remembered the last time she had interrupted a meeting, the tight smile he gave her, the barely concealed frustration in his voice as he promised to call back later. So she walked to the park instead, hoping the fresh air would settle whatever storm was brewing inside her small body. The swing offered comfort, a familiar motion that reminded her of better days when her mother would push her high into the sky, both of them laughing until their sides hurt. Now, the chains creaked with a lonely sound, and the sky above seemed to press down rather than open up. Marco Delgado pushed his cleaning cart along the park's perimeter path, his routine as fixed as the sunrise. Every afternoon at 4:30, he made his rounds through Riverside Park, emptying trash bins and sweeping away the debris of human presence. He wore the navy blue uniform of the city's sanitation department, his name embroidered in faded white thread above his heart. At 53, his body bore the evidence of decades spent in manual labor. His hands were calloused and scarred, his shoulders permanently rounded from years of bending and lifting, his face weathered by sun and wind, and the weight of disappointments too numerous to count. He noticed the small figure on the swing from a distance, her stillness unusual for a child. Most kids pumped their legs with wild energy, racing toward the sky. This girl barely moved. Something in her posture triggered an alert in Marco's mind, the same instinct that once made him a good father before circumstances stripped that role away from him. As he drew closer, Marco saw the girl's head drop forward, her chin nearly touching her chest. Her hands slipped from the chains, and her body began to list sideways with the slow inevitability of a tree losing its fight with gravity. He abandoned his cart and ran, his worn work boots slapping against the concrete path, his breath coming hard in his chest. He reached her just as she tumbled from the swing, catching her small frame before she hit the ground. Her skin felt burning hot through her thin jacket, and her eyes rolled back, showing only whites. Panic flooded through him, sharp and cold. He had seen this before, years ago, with his own daughter. Fever climbing too high too fast, the body shutting down in defense. His hands shook as he pressed his palm to her forehead, confirming what he already knew. This child needed help immediately, and the park stretched empty in all directions. Marco pulled his phone from his pocket with trembling fingers. The screen cracked from a dozen falls, but still functional. He dialed emergency services, his voice urgent as he described the situation. A young girl, unconscious, burning with fever, alone in Riverside Park. The dispatcher's calm questions felt like torture, each second stretching into eternity while the child's breath came shallow and rapid against his chest. How old was she? He guessed 8 or 9. Did she have any identification? He fumbled through her backpack with one hand while cradling her with the other, finding a student ID from Westbrook Elementary. Mia Hunter, grade 4. The dispatcher told him an ambulance was on its way, but the nearest hospital was St. Mary's, 15 minutes across town, and rush-hour traffic would slow everything down. Marco looked at the girl's pale face, at the blue tinge creeping around her lips, and made a decision that bypassed all protocol and common sense. He gathered Mia into his arms, her small body frighteningly light, her head lolling against his shoulder. His cleaning cart sat abandoned on the path, its contents spilling onto the concrete, but none of that mattered now. Marco ran toward the parking lot where his ancient pickup truck waited, its paint oxidized to a dull gray, its engine temperamental on the best of days. He laid Mia across the bench seat, her breathing now so shallow he had to press his fingers to her neck to feel the flutter of her pulse. The truck's engine coughed and sputtered before catching, and Marco pulled out of the parking lot with a squeal of tires, his foot heavy on the accelerator. The city blurred past his windows as he raced towards St. Mary's emergency room, running red lights and weaving through traffic while his heart hammered against his ribs. In the passenger seat, Mia Hunter fought a battle her small body might not win, and Marco prayed to a god he had stopped believing in years ago, bargaining everything he had left for this stranger's child to survive. The emergency room doors burst open with Marco's shoulder driving them wide. Mia's limp form cradled against his chest like a sacred offering. Fluorescent lights assaulted his vision after the dimness of twilight outside, and the sharp smell of disinfectant mixed with fear flooded his senses. A nurse behind the triage desk looked up from her computer screen, her professional mask slipping for just a moment as she registered the scene. A weathered man in a janitor's uniform, work boots leaving muddy tracks across the polished floor, holding a child whose skin had taken on a waxy translucence. Marco's voice cracked as he spoke, the words tumbling out in a desperate rush. She collapsed in the park, fever too high, breathing shallow, pulse weak. The nurse was already moving, calling for a gurney for Dr. Chen for immediate intervention. Other staff materialized from behind curtains and through doorways, a choreographed emergency response that Marco watched through a haze of adrenaline and exhaustion. They took Mia from his arms, and suddenly Marco felt the full weight of what he had done. The risk he had taken in moving her, in not waiting for the ambulance. His hands hung empty at his sides, still warm from her fevered skin. A young resident fired questions at him while they rushed Mia through double doors marked "Staff Only." Was she his daughter? No. Did he know her medical history? No. Any allergies? He didn't know. Emergency contacts? He fumbled with her backpack again, finding a form with a phone number listed under father. The resident grabbed the paper and disappeared, leaving Marco standing in the middle of the emergency room, his uniform soaked with sweat, his hands shaking uncontrollably now that the crisis moment had passed. A security guard approached him, not threatening but cautious, asking him to wait in the lobby while they contacted the girl's family. Marco nodded and allowed himself to be guided to a plastic chair near the vending machines, where he sat with his head in his hands and tried to slow his racing heart. The minutes crawled past with agonizing slowness. Marco stared at his boots, at the mud he had tracked across the pristine floors, at the tremor in his fingers that wouldn't stop no matter how hard he pressed his palms together. Around him, The emergency room pulsed with controlled chaos. A man holding a blood-soaked towel to his hand, a woman rocking a crying infant, an elderly couple sitting in stunned silence after receiving news that changed everything. Marco recognized the landscape of human suffering because he had lived in it for so long. 12 years ago, he had sat in a different emergency room, in a different city, waiting for news about his own daughter. That time, the news had been final and devastating. Carmen had been 14, full of life and dreams and the beautiful defiance of adolescence. A faulty heater in their apartment, carbon monoxide silent and invisible. And by the time Marco came home from his night shift, it was too late. His daughter gone, his wife, Maria, broken beyond repair. Their marriage dissolved within a year, both of them drowning in separate oceans of grief. Marco pulled Eleanor's locket from his pocket, the metal warm from being pressed against his chest all afternoon. He had found it in the park 3 weeks ago, lying in the grass near the playground, its delicate chain tangled with fallen leaves. He should have turned it into the park office, but something made him keep it. Some instinct that this object held significance beyond its material value. The locket was old, probably an heirloom, gold-plated and engraved with tiny flowers along its edge. He had opened it once, seeing the photograph inside. A beautiful woman with kind eyes and a smile that suggested she knew secrets worth keeping. He meant to find its owner, had even asked around the park, but no one claimed it. So he carried it, a talisman of someone else's love story, a reminder that beauty and connection still existed somewhere in the world. He traced the engraving with his thumb, finding strange comfort in this stolen moment of intimacy with a stranger's memory. The double doors burst open again, and a tall man in an expensive suit strode through, his face a mask of barely controlled panic. James Hunter moved with the authority of someone accustomed to commanding rooms and bending circumstances to his will, but here in the emergency room, all his power meant nothing. He rushed to the nurse's station, his voice loud and demanding. His daughter, Mia Hunter, where was she? The nurse spoke in soothing tones, explaining that she was being stabilized, that Dr. Chen was with her now, that he would be able to see her soon. James ran his hands through his hair, his perfectly styled appearance cracking under the weight of fear. Marco watched from his chair across the room, recognizing the shape of paternal terror because he had worn it himself once. This man, despite his obvious wealth and status, was just another father facing the possibility of losing everything that mattered. Marco felt an unexpected kinship with him, a bridge across the chasm of their different circumstances. A nurse approached Marco, her expression softer now, and asked him to follow her to a small consultation room. She wanted his account of what happened, needed details for the medical record. Marco stood, his legs stiff from sitting, and followed her down a corridor lined with examination rooms. Behind one of the curtains, he heard Mia's voice, weak but conscious, asking for her daddy. The sound released something in Marco's chest, a knot of tension he hadn't realized he was carrying. She was awake. She would survive. The nurse guided him into a small room with a table and 2 chairs, and he sat down heavily, suddenly aware of how tired he was, how much this afternoon had taken from him. She asked her questions, and he answered them as completely as he could, describing the empty park, the way Mia had fallen from the swing, his decision to drive her here himself. The nurse nodded, writing everything down, and then she asked the question Marco had been dreading. Why had he been watching the girl? Was there any reason beyond coincidence that he had been near her? The implication hung in the air between them, ugly and unavoidable. Marco felt heat rise in his face, shame mixing with anger. He understood the question's necessity in a world where children needed protection from predators, but it still cut deep to be viewed with suspicion when he had just saved a life. He explained his job, his daily routine of cleaning the park, his completely innocent presence at the right moment. The nurse's expression softened with what might have been apology, and she thanked him for his quick action, for potentially saving Mia's life. Marco nodded, accepting her words without joy, knowing that in an hour or two he would be forgotten, his role in this story reduced to a footnote in the medical record. The stranger who happened to be there, the janitor with the right instincts and the courage to act. He would return to his small apartment, to his routines of work and solitude, and Mia Hunter would grow up never remembering the man who carried her to safety. That was how these things worked. He had long ago accepted his invisibility in the world. James Hunter stood beside his daughter's hospital bed, his hand wrapped around her small fingers, his eyes burning with exhaustion and relief. Mia slept peacefully now, her fever broken by antibiotics and careful monitoring, her breathing steady and deep. The doctor had explained that she had developed a severe bacterial infection, something that had escalated quickly and dangerously. But they had caught it in time thanks to the quick response of the man who brought her in. James barely registered the words, his attention fixed on his daughter's face, so much like Eleanor's that it hurt to look at her sometimes. He had failed her today, failed to be reachable when she needed him, failed to notice she was sick before she wandered off to that park alone. The weight of his inadequacy pressed down on his shoulders, heavier than any boardroom pressure or business crisis he had ever faced. His eyes traveled over Mia's form, checking and rechecking that she was truly all right, that this nightmare had not stolen her away from him the way it had stolen Eleanor 2 years ago. That was when he saw it, the locket resting against Mia's chest, visible above the hospital gown's neckline. James froze, his breath catching in his throat. He knew that locket. He had given it to Eleanor on their 5th anniversary, had watched her open it with tears in her eyes, had helped her place their wedding photo inside its delicate frame. Eleanor had worn it every day until her battle with illness made jewelry too uncomfortable, too painful against her sensitive skin. In her final weeks, she had asked James to keep it safe, to give it to Mia when their daughter was old enough to understand what it represented. A love that transcended mortality, a promise that family endured beyond physical presence. James reached out with trembling fingers and lifted the locket, examining it in the harsh hospital light. There was no question, no possibility of mistake. The tiny dent on the back edge where Eleanor had dropped it in the kitchen, the specific pattern of wear on the chain's clasp, the engraving of intertwined roses that Eleanor had chosen because they bloomed in her grandmother's garden. This was Eleanor's locket, the one that had been missing since her passing, the one James had torn their house apart searching for, convinced it had been misplaced during the chaos of those final terrible months. He had assumed it was lost forever, had grieved its absence almost as much as he grieved Eleanor herself, and now here it was, hanging from his daughter's neck, its presence impossible and inexplicable. How? His mind raced through scenarios, each more unlikely than the last. Had Mia found it somewhere in the house, hidden in some corner James had missed? But she had been at school, and then the park. She hadn't been home. The nurse who had been checking Mia's vitals noticed James's intense focus on the locket. She smiled gently and explained that the man who brought Mia in had placed it around her neck while they were stabilizing her, saying he found it in the park and thought it might bring her comfort. James's world tilted on its axis. The stranger, the janitor who had saved Mia's life, had been carrying Eleanor's locket. The implications crashed over James in waves. This man had found it, had kept it for some unknown reason, and then had returned it in the moment of Mia's greatest need. The coincidence felt too enormous to be random, too weighted with meaning to be mere chance. James needed to speak with this man, needed to understand how Eleanor's most precious possession had come to be in his hands, needed to know if this was fate, or cosmic accident, or something else entirely that his rational mind couldn't categorize. James left Mia's side and strode back to the nurse's station with renewed urgency, his exhaustion forgotten in the face of this mystery. He asked about the man who brought his daughter in, demanded to know where he was, whether he was still in the hospital. The nurse checked her records and shook her head apologetically. The man had given his statement and left about an hour ago, not wanting to intrude on family time, not expecting thanks or recognition. His name was Marco Delgado, employed by the City Parks Department. Address on file from his driver's license when they checked his identification. James pulled out his phone immediately, his fingers flying across the screen as he searched for ways to locate this Marco Delgado, to find him before he disappeared completely back into whatever anonymous life he led. The nurse offered to provide the contact information, and James took it with hands that had steadied now that he had a concrete action to take, a problem to solve, a mystery to unravel. The night deepened around St. Mary's Hospital, and James remained at Mia's bedside, his laptop open on his knees while his daughter slept. He worked mechanically through emails and documents, his mind elsewhere, turning over questions that had no easy answers. Why would a stranger keep a lost locket for weeks? What had made him give it back at that particular moment? And most troublingly, most persistently, was there some connection between Marco Delgado and Eleanor that James had never known about? The thought felt like betrayal, even as it formed, but James couldn't shake it. Eleanor had been unfailingly kind, the type of person who noticed the invisible people others walked past, janitors and waitresses and delivery drivers. She had taught Mia the same consciousness, the same fundamental respect for every human, regardless of their station. Had Eleanor known Marco somehow? Had she lost the locket in the park during one of her walks, during the months when walking was the only exercise she could manage? James typed Marco's name into search engines, finding only fragments of a life lived mostly offline, an old address in California, a marriage certificate from 25 years ago, a daughter's birth announcement, and then much later, a daughter's obituary. Carmen Delgado, dead at 14, causes not listed. James sat back in his chair, the puzzle pieces rearranging themselves into a different picture. Marco had lost a child. He had lived through the nightmare that James had come so close to experiencing today, and somehow this man who understood the fragility of parenthood, who carried the weight of irreversible loss, had been in the right place at the right time to save Mia's life. James looked at his sleeping daughter, at the locket rising and falling with her breath, and felt something shift inside him. Gratitude, yes, but also something deeper, a debt that couldn't be repaid with money or words, a connection that demanded acknowledgement. Tomorrow he would find Marco Delgado. He would look this stranger in the eye and try to understand what cosmic mercy had placed him in that park at that exact moment. And he would thank him, though thank you felt impossibly inadequate for the gift of his daughter's life. Marco's apartment building stood in a neighborhood that Portland's prosperity had not yet reached, its brick facade crumbling at the corners, its parking lot potholed and poorly lit. He climbed the stairs to the third floor, his body aching from the day's exertions, his mind still replaying those desperate moments in the park. Inside his small one-bedroom unit, everything sat exactly as he had left it that morning. The dishes drying in the rack by the sink, the old television silent against the wall, the photograph of Carmen on the bookshelf, surrounded by the few possessions he had kept from his former life. Marco dropped his keys on the counter and sank into his worn armchair, exhaustion finally claiming him now that the adrenaline had fully drained away. He should eat something, should shower and prepare for tomorrow's early shift, but instead he just sat in the gathering darkness, watching the city lights flicker through his window. The knock on his door came as a complete surprise. Pulling Marco from the edge of sleep, he glanced at the clock. Nearly 9 in the evening, far too late for casual visitors, and he had no friends who would drop by unannounced. He approached the door cautiously, years of living in marginal neighborhoods having taught him vigilance. Through the peephole, he saw James Hunter, still in his expensive suit but looking rumpled now, human, his usual commanding presence softened by obvious distress. Marco's heart jumped. Something had happened to Mia. The infection had worsened. His intervention had caused harm instead of help. He opened the door with dread coiling in his stomach, bracing himself for accusations or grief or both. James spoke immediately, his words rushing out before Marco could form his own questions. Mia was fine, resting comfortably, expected to make a full recovery. The doctor said another hour without treatment, and the outcome might have been very different. Marco sagged against the doorframe with relief so profound it made him dizzy. James continued, asking if he could come in, if they could talk. Marco stepped back automatically, gesturing toward his humble living space with embarrassment. He saw his apartment through this wealthy man's eyes, the threadbare furniture, the water-stained ceiling, the general air of making do with less than enough. But James didn't seem to notice or judge. He stood in the center of the small room, his attention fixed on Marco with an intensity that made the janitor uncomfortable. James reached into his pocket and pulled out the locket, holding it up between them. The gold caught the light from the street lamp outside, glinting with significance. Marco's mouth went dry. He had forgotten about the locket in the chaos of getting Mia to the hospital, had placed it around her neck without thinking, some instinct telling him she needed protection, and he had nothing else to offer. Now he realized his mistake. James would think he had stolen it, would assume the worst about his motives and his character. Marco tried to explain, his words stumbling over themselves. He found it in the park weeks ago, meant to turn it in, kept it because no one claimed it, never intended to keep it permanently. He had been trying to find the owner, but had no idea where to start. James held up a hand, stopping the flow of desperate justification. His face showed no anger, no accusation. Instead, his eyes held something Marco couldn't quite read. Wonder, perhaps, or confusion, or the beginning of understanding something too large to name. James told him about Eleanor, about the locket's history, about how it had been missing since her passing. He spoke quietly, his voice thick with emotion, explaining that this object represented everything he had shared with his wife, every promise they had made to each other and to Mia. Marco listened with growing comprehension and dismay. He had been carrying a dead woman's most precious possession, a widower's connection to lost love, and he hadn't known, couldn't have known. He tried to apologize, but James shook his head again. There was no apology needed. If anything, James owed Marco more than he could ever repay, not just for finding the locket, but for saving Mia, for being present when he himself had failed. The words hung between them, heavy with meaning. Two men who had lost people they loved, two fathers separated by circumstance but united by the fundamental terror of a child in danger. James asked Marco to sit, and they settled on opposite ends of the worn couch, the locket resting on the coffee table between them like a talisman. James wanted to know about Marco, about his life, about how he came to be in that park at that moment. Marco told his story reluctantly, unaccustomed to being the subject of anyone's interest. He spoke of Carmen, of her death, of the marriage that couldn't survive such devastating loss. He explained his trajectory from California to Oregon, from a decent job as a building superintendent to his current position cleaning parks, from a life with purpose to a life of simple routine and solitude. He didn't mention the drinking that had cost him several jobs, or the depression that sometimes made getting out of bed feel like climbing a mountain, or the way he had given up on most things except continuing to exist. But James seemed to understand anyway, seemed to recognize the shape of grief, because he wore his own version of it. James talked about Eleanor, about her illness, About the 2 years since her passing that had left him and Mia adrift in a house that felt too empty, despite its 5 bedrooms and designer furniture. He spoke of burying himself in work because work made sense, because Excel spreadsheets and quarterly reports didn't demand emotional processing or vulnerable conversations. He admitted what he rarely acknowledged even to himself, that he had failed Mia in his grief, had left her essentially orphaned despite being alive, had chosen the easier pain of professional demands over the harder pain of being present for his daughter's sorrow. His voice cracked as he described the call from the hospital, the drive across the city with his heart in his throat, the certainty that God or fate or the universe was punishing him for his failures. And then seeing Mia alive, seeing the locket, and understanding that he had been given a second chance he didn't deserve. Marco recognized every word, every feeling. They were the same, he and this CEO, just 2 broken men trying to survive the unsurvivable. The days following Mia's hospitalization moved with strange distortion, time both accelerating and standing still. James had taken a leave from work, something unprecedented in his 15-year tenure as CEO, shocking his board members and executive team into stunned silence. He couldn't remember the last time he had taken even a full weekend away from emails and conference calls. But now he sat beside Mia's hospital bed reading stories, helping her with schoolwork sent by her teacher, watching mindless television shows that made her laugh. He marveled at how much of her he had missed, while being physically present, but emotionally absent. The way she chewed her lower lip when concentrating, her habit of humming tunelessly when content, the specific cadence of her laughter. So much like Eleanor's, it stopped his heart each time. He had let grief blind him to the living miracle still in his care. Marco visited the hospital on his day off, carrying a small stuffed bear from the hospital gift shop, feeling awkward and out of place among the well-dressed visitors in the pediatric ward. Mia's face lit up when she saw him, recognition immediate, despite her limited consciousness during their first encounter. She called him the park man, the nice man who carried her when she was sick. Marco felt his throat tighten with emotion he hadn't experienced in years. The simple joy of being appreciated, of mattering to someone. Mia asked him to sit, patted the chair beside her bed with the unconscious authority of a child accustomed to being loved. James watched this interaction from across the room, seeing something shift in Marco's weathered face, a softening of the hard edges that life had carved into him. For the next hour, Marco told Mia stories about the animals he saw in the park, the family of raccoons living near the creek, the red-tailed hawk that nested in the old oak tree, the industrious squirrels preparing for winter. Mia listened with complete attention, asking questions, laughing at his descriptions, treating this janitor with the same respect she would give anyone. As Mia's discharge approached, James found himself facing a decision he hadn't anticipated. He invited Marco to dinner at their house, wanting Mia to properly thank him, wanting to continue a conversation they had only begun. Marco tried to decline, uncomfortable with the implied inequality, but James insisted with surprising intensity. This wasn't charity or obligation, it was connection. Something James realized he desperately needed, though he couldn't fully articulate why. So on a Saturday evening, Marco drove his battered truck through the gate of James's estate in the West Hills, the sprawling house overlooking the city below. He parked beside vehicles worth more than he earned in 3 years, his hands sweating on the steering wheel. This was a mistake. He didn't belong here. But then the front door opened, and Mia came running out in her pajamas, Eleanor's locket bouncing against her chest, calling his name with pure delight. And Marco found himself walking toward the house, toward whatever this evening would bring. Dinner was simple by James's standards, but extraordinary by Marco's. Roasted chicken, fresh vegetables, homemade bread. James had cooked it himself, another unprecedented action, and Marco could see the man was rusty at it. The vegetables slightly overdone, the bread a bit dense. But the effort mattered more than perfection. They sat at the kitchen table rather than the formal dining room, Mia between them, chattering about school and friends and the books she was reading. James asked Marco about his work, genuinely interested, asking questions that revealed he had no idea what a park janitor's daily life involved. Marco described his routes through different parks, the seasonal changes he witnessed, the people he observed from the margins. He talked about finding lost items, keys, phones, toys, jewelry, and his usual practice of turning them into the park office. He didn't mention that he had broken that practice with the Locket, drawn to it for reasons he still couldn't explain. After dinner, while Mia watched a movie in the living room, James and Marco sat on the back deck overlooking the city lights. James poured 2 glasses of whiskey from a bottle that probably cost more than Marco's monthly rent, and they sat in companionable silence for several minutes. Then James began talking about Eleanor, really talking, in ways he hadn't done with anyone since her passing. He described how they met in college, 2 kids from different worlds who found in each other something neither knew they were missing. Eleanor had come from money, but rejected its superficial values, volunteering at homeless shelters and soup kitchens, insisting on seeing people rather than categories. She had made James better, had taught him to use his business acumen for something beyond profit. Together, they had started a foundation focused on education and healthcare access. Eleanor's passion given wings by James's resources. After Mia was born, Eleanor had pulled back from public work, but never from her values. She had taught Mia to see everyone's humanity, to never walk past suffering without acknowledging it. Marco listened, recognizing in James's description the kind of woman who would have noticed a janitor, who would have spoken to him as an equal. He mentioned this observation, and James nodded vigorously. Eleanor had loved the park, had walked there almost daily during her illness, when walking was possible. She had probably seen Marco, probably spoken to him, probably carried the memory of some small interaction that Marco didn't remember, but that mattered to her. The Locket could have been lost on any of those walks, dropped without her noticing, left behind as her body failed and her focus turned inward to survival. Marco felt a strange comfort in this possibility, that he had shared space with Eleanor Hunter, that he might have been part of her world in some small way, that his return of the Locket completed a circle neither of them could have predicted. James seemed to feel it too. This sense of connection across death, across class boundaries, across the ordinary divisions that kept people separate. James asked about Carmen, and Marco found himself talking about his daughter in ways he usually avoided, describing her love of music, her terrible jokes, her fierce loyalty to her friends. He spoke of the guilt he carried for working night shifts, for not being home that terrible evening, for failing in the most basic parental duty of keeping his child safe. James listened without offering empty platitudes or false comfort. When Marco finished, James simply said that he understood, that parental guilt was perhaps the most universal human experience, that every father he knew carried some version of the same weight. The acknowledgement mattered more than absolution. They sat together as darkness deepened, and the city below sparkled with artificial stars. 2 men who had walked through fire and emerged scarred but not destroyed, finding in each other's presence a relief from the isolation grief imposed. When Marco finally left, near midnight, driving his truck back down the hill toward his neighborhood, he felt something he hadn't experienced in years. Not quite hope, but its precursor. The possibility that his life might contain more than mere endurance, the chance that connection, real human connection, wasn't forever beyond his reach. James stood in Eleanor's study, a room he had kept exactly as she left it, a shrine to her absence. Her books lined the shelves in the order she preferred. Her desk still held papers from projects she would never complete, her favorite sweater draped over the chair back, as if she might return any moment and slip it on. He came here when he needed to feel close to her, when the house felt too silent and his decisions too heavy. Tonight he carried the locket, now properly cleaned and repaired by a jeweler who specialized in heirloom pieces. Inside, he had placed a new photograph. Eleanor and Mia together at the beach, both laughing, the ocean behind them, a moment of pure joy captured just months before the diagnosis. He clicked the locket shut and held it in his palm, feeling its weight, understanding now why Eleanor had wanted Mia to have it eventually. It was a promise that love survived, that memory mattered, that the people we lose stay with us in ways beyond physical presence. Mia appeared in the doorway, her presence quiet but noticed. She'd been doing this more often since coming home from the hospital, seeking him out, wanting his attention, testing whether his newfound availability would last. James opened his arms, and she came to him, curling against his side in the chair, her small body fitting perfectly in the space his grief had tried to fill with work and avoidance. She asked about Marco, whether they would see him again. James admitted he didn't know, but hoped so. Mia nodded solemnly and said she liked Marco, that he reminded her of Grandpa before Grandpa got too old to visit. James asked what she meant, and Mia explained that Marco really listened, that he looked at her when she talked, that he seemed interested in her thoughts and opinions. The observation cut James deeply because he recognized the implicit criticism. How long had it been since he truly listened to his daughter? Since he gave her his full attention, without his mind wandering to work problems or grief spirals. In the weeks that followed, a pattern emerged without anyone formally establishing it. Marco would come to dinner every Thursday evening, initially at James's invitation, then simply because it became expected, a rhythm all three of them needed. On these evenings they ate together, talked about their days, watched movies or played board games that James hadn't touched since Eleanor's passing. Marco brought a quietness to the house that balanced James's intensity, a patience that allowed Mia to talk without feeling rushed or judged. He helped with homework sometimes, his knowledge surprising given his limited formal education. He knew history from reading voraciously during lonely nights, could explain scientific concepts with clarity, corrected grammar with gentle precision. Mia bloomed under the attention of two adults who genuinely cared about her well-being, her nightmares about losing her mother becoming less frequent, her laughter returning with increasing regularity. James found himself confiding in Marco about business decisions, about ethical dilemmas that arose in corporate leadership, about the tension between maximizing profits and maintaining Eleanor's vision of conscious capitalism. Marco listened and asked questions that cut through corporate speak to fundamental principles, forcing James to examine his assumptions and motivations. It became clear that Marco possessed a wisdom that formal education couldn't provide, a moral clarity born from loss and struggle, and paying attention to life's harder lessons. James began implementing changes at his company: better wages for support staff, improved benefits, transparent pathways for advancement, regardless of educational credentials. His executive team pushed back, worried about profit margins and shareholder expectations, but James held firm. Eleanor would have approved, and somehow that mattered more than quarterly earnings. One evening, after Mia had gone to bed, James asked Marco if he would consider leaving the parks department to work for the Hunter Foundation, managing their community outreach programs. The salary would be substantial, the work meaningful, the opportunity to honor both Carmen and Eleanor through service to others. Marco sat in stunned silence, his whiskey glass frozen halfway to his lips. James explained his thinking. Marco understood poverty and struggle in ways James never could, had credibility with populations that needed help most, possessed the emotional intelligence to connect across barriers. The foundation needed someone who wouldn't treat recipients as charity cases, but as human beings deserving of respect and genuine assistance. Marco's first instinct was to refuse, to say he wasn't qualified, wasn't educated enough, wasn't the right person. But then he thought about Carmen, about what she might have become if given opportunities, about the difference real support could have made for his family during their darkest times. Marco asked for time to think about it, and James nodded, understanding the weight of such a decision. To leave the safety of routine, to risk failure in a role far beyond his experience, to step into visibility after years of intentional invisibility. These weren't small considerations. Marco drove home that night with his mind churning, memories of Eleanor's locket tangling with visions of Carmen, wondering if this improbable intersection of lives contained meaning beyond coincidence. He thought about the park where he found the locket, the same park where Mia collapsed, the same park Eleanor had walked during her final months. What were the odds? What invisible threads connected these moments into a pattern that looked increasingly like purpose? Marco had stopped believing in divine intervention years ago, had decided the universe was random and indifferent. But now he wondered. He wondered if Eleanor's locket had found its way into his hands for a reason. If Carmen's death, rather than ending all possibility of redemption, had somehow prepared him for this moment, if the desperate hour in that empty park was not coincidence but convergence, everything leading to now. The photograph of Carmen on his bookshelf seemed to glow in the dim apartment light, her smile eternal and encouraging. Marco imagined what she would tell him, heard her teenage voice in his memory urging him to take risks, to live fully, to not let fear make him small. She had been braver than he was, right up until the moment she stopped breathing. He owed it to her memory to be brave now, to step toward possibility, even if it meant risking his heart, his pride, his carefully constructed walls. At 3 a.m, Marco sent James a text message, just 2 words that changed everything. He wrote, "I'm in." The Hunter Foundation occupied the 4th floor of a renovated building in downtown Portland, its walls lined with photographs documenting 20 years of Eleanor's vision transformed into concrete assistance. James had arranged an office for Marco near the main conference room, its window overlooking the Willamette River, its desk solid and purposeful. On Marco's first official day, staff members stopped by to introduce themselves, curious about this unexpected hire, cautiously welcoming despite their uncertainty about his qualifications. Marco felt their doubt like a physical weight, understood he would need to prove himself daily, but he also felt something he hadn't experienced since Carmen's death. Anticipation, possibility, the sensation of moving forward rather than merely existing. His hands shook slightly as he opened the first file of grant applications, reading stories of struggle and resilience that mirrored his own, recognizing himself in every desperate request for a second chance. Mia adjusted to her new reality with the resilience children possess when given love and stability. She wore Eleanor's locket every day, touching it unconsciously when nervous or sad, drawing strength from the physical connection to her mother. Her grades improved, her nightmares decreased, her laughter became frequent enough that James sometimes stopped what he was doing just to listen to it, storing the sound against future sorrows. She talked about Marco with casual affection, mentioning things he had said or taught her, incorporating his presence into her sense of family without questioning whether this configuration was conventional. At school, when asked to draw her family for an art project, she included 3 figures, herself in the middle, her father on one side, and Marco on the other. All 3 holding hands beneath a tree that looked suspiciously like the oak in Riverside Park. James found himself transformed by the choice to slow down, to prioritize presence over productivity. He delegated more at the company, trusted his executive team, learned to say no to opportunities that would consume the evenings and weekends he now protected fiercely. His board noticed the shift, some members expressing concern about his reduced availability. But the company's performance remained strong, its reputation for ethical practices growing, its employee satisfaction scores rising. James realized what Eleanor had tried to tell him during their final conversations, that success measured purely in financial terms was hollow, that legacy meant how you treated people, that nothing mattered more than showing up for the ones you loved. He wished desperately that he had understood this while Eleanor was still alive, that he could have given her his full attention during those last precious months. But regret, he was learning, could coexist with gratitude. He couldn't change the past, but he could honor Eleanor by being present for Mia now, by building the life Eleanor had wanted for their daughter. Marco surprised everyone, perhaps most of all himself, by excelling at his new role. He brought to the Foundation's work an authenticity that transformed how they operated. He insisted on meeting every grant recipient personally, on understanding their full story rather than just their financial need. He pushed the Foundation to fund not just projects, but people, to provide sustained support rather than one-time assistance. He challenged wealthy donors to see beneficiaries as equals rather than charity cases, his quiet intensity more effective than any polished pitch. Within 6 months, the Foundation's reach had expanded significantly, its reputation for genuine engagement rather than performative philanthropy growing throughout the non-profit sector. Marco still lived in his small apartment, still drove his old truck, but his life now contained purpose beyond survival. He woke each morning with tasks that mattered, with people depending on him, with the knowledge that his work honored both Carmen's memory and Eleanor's vision. On the second anniversary of Eleanor's death, the three of them, James, Mia, and Marco, returned to Riverside Park. They chose the same bench where Eleanor had often sat during her walks, now dedicated with a small plaque James had installed, in memory of Eleanor Hunter, who saw everyone's light. They sat together in comfortable silence, watching leaves fall from the oak tree, observing parents push children on the same swings where Mia had collapsed 2 years earlier. The park had witnessed their worst moments and somehow also held the seeds of their healing. Mia wore the locket, James carried a bouquet of Eleanor's favorite roses, and Marco brought the stuffed bear he had given Mia in the hospital, now worn from constant companionship. They didn't pray or perform any formal ceremony. They simply sat together, 3 people bound by loss and saved by connection, their presence together a testament to resilience and grace and the unexpected ways love continues. James thought about the man he had been 2 years ago. Driven, successful, and fundamentally alone, despite being surrounded by people. That man had lost his wife, and nearly lost his daughter to his own negligence, his inability to see beyond his own grief. Now he looked at Mia, reading contentedly beside him, at Marco watching the park with the quiet attention of someone who had learned to appreciate small moments, and felt a gratitude so profound it bordered on reverence. Marco had given him back more than Mia's life that desperate afternoon. He had shown James a different way of being in the world, a path through grief that led not to isolation, but to connection. The locket had been the key that unlocked everything else, a piece of Eleanor's love finding its way home through the hands of a stranger who understood loss intimately enough to recognize what mattered. Marco felt the weight of 2 lives in his chest, Carmen's memory and this unexpected second family he had been given. He would never stop missing his daughter, would always carry the guilt and sorrow of her loss. But now those feelings existed alongside new emotions, purpose, belonging, the quiet joy of being needed and appreciated. He thought about the cosmic improbability of his trajectory, how finding a lost locket had led to saving a child, which had led to friendship with a man who should have been completely beyond his orbit, which had led to meaningful work and genuine connection. If someone had told him 2 years ago that his life would contain this much goodness, he would have laughed bitterly at the impossibility. Yet here he was, sitting in the park where everything changed, feeling Carmen's approval like a warm breeze, allowing himself to believe that redemption was real. As the sun began its descent toward the western hills, they rose from the bench together. Mia took both men's hands, swinging between them as they walked toward the parking lot, her contentment visible in every line of her small body. James and Marco exchanged a glance over her head, a look that required no words because they understood each other completely. They had both been broken by loss, had both learned that survival was its own kind of victory, had both discovered that the human heart possessed an astonishing capacity to heal when given love and purpose and grace. Eleanor's locket swung from Mia's neck, catching the fading light, its presence a reminder that nothing was ever truly lost. Love continued, transformed but undiminished. Family could be found in unexpected places. And sometimes, in the space between tragedy and recovery, ordinary people performed extraordinary acts that changed everything. The janitor had carried a sick girl to the emergency room on a desperate autumn afternoon, and in doing so, had carried all three of them toward wholeness. The rest of their lives stretched ahead, uncertain but full of possibility, and they walked into it together.